Welcome back to Where the Ramp Ends. I'm Bryce.
And I'm Summer, and today we are joined by Stephanie Smith Lee, co director of policy and advocacy at the National Down Syndrome Congress. With, me- with more than 35 years of experience in disability rights and public policy, Stephanie has served in senior roles in the U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, and the Office of Special Education Programs. She is a nationally respected advocate whose work has helped shape disability policy and advance opportunities for people with disabilities across the country. And more importantly, she is the mother of a young woman that had Down syndrome. And we're going to get to hear about who her daughter was. We're excited to have Stephanie. We're excited to have you here today and share your insights on advocacy, policy, and the future of disability rights.
Thank you for having me on, Bryce and Summer.
Absolutely.
Stephanie, your daughter Laura was born in 1982 at a time when opportunities for people with Down syndrome looked very different than they do today. Can you tell us what were those early years like for your family?
Those early years were really tough for our family. A bright spot was that my son Andrew was 3 years old at the time and just happened to be in an inclusive cooperative preschool that was funded by the Office of Special Education Programs to be a national model. So when Laura was born, the doctors didn't have any information for us. There was nothing in the library, but we'd gotten to know children at this preschool and their parents, and they came to the hospital. A number of them came to the hospital to talk to us, and it was these other parents who told us, "Your daughter has Down syndrome. You need to have her heart checked." I don't know if the doctors didn't notice that Laura was missing the middle of her heart or just didn't tell us. It's hard to imagine they wouldn't know that just from listening, but in any case, she immediately had her heart checked and was rushed to Children's Hospital, in Washington, D.C., and stayed there for most of her first couple of years and had 2 open heart surgeries then and later open heart surgeries, as she grew. But those first couple of years, trying to be at the hospital night and day, having a 3-year-old at home, parents being overseas, in a mission, not able to help. It was really hard, and she was home briefly one time, and one of the preschool teachers, who also was a mother of a child with disabilities, saw Laura and looked shocked at just how sick she looked, and, that teacher immediately started organizing rides for Andrew to school and meals for our family, and when I said, "I don't know how I'll ever be able to repay you," she said, "You don't repay me, you help the next one," and that's always stayed with me.
Wow. What an incredible story where your son being exposed to families that had children with disabilities, those families kind of stepped in and taught you when that education wasn't available.
Right, exactly. And it really shows how beautiful our community is that we're willing to step up for each other no matter the if we're family related or not, we become a family. And this leads into my first question, Stephanie. Was there a moment where you realized you weren't going to just be an advocate for your daughter, but you were going to work to change systems for all individuals with disabilities?
Well, that's a good question, Bryce. I always felt that if I wanted Laura included, and I did, that I needed to include myself by volunteering at her school, at church, and the community. I started out as a room mother and then a PTA president, then started organizing a successful effort to save our small school from being closed. And one thing kind of led to another, organized a coalition to stop our school district from drastic cuts to special education. And then I just got mad about a plan to reduce funding for students of teachers with intellectual disabilities, and organized a 3-year grassroots effort that resulted in the law being changed and $3 million a year for these students. And then another effort in Virginia, uh, when Virginia was uh, trying to remove everything in the federal special education, remove everything in the state special education regulations that were not in the federal regulations, join together with other families and stop that. So it just evolved naturally from being Laura's mom and a room mother, and one thing led to another.
That's wonderful. Looking back over your 4 decades of advocacy, what changes have you seen in society's expectations of the Down syndrome community, and what makes you most proud to be a part of it?
Well, when Laura was born in 1982, the life expectancy for people with Down syndrome was quite short. We were told by the genetics doctor not to expect Laura to be able to work or live in the community. One doctor urged us to, quote, put her away. But you know what? Laura exceeded every low expectation. She went to the first inclusive college program. She worked at the World Bank. She attended art classes in our community and lived in a townhouse with roommates with support. And Laura's not the only one who's exceeded expectations. Over the past 4+ decades, so much has improved. Life expectancy is longer. There have been improvements in information for new parents, improvements in healthcare, education, employment opportunities. And, things are not perfect, but they certainly have improved. And as more students with disabilities are included in general education classes, the other students in those classes are growing up with people with disabilities as their friends and neighbors. And so while we still have a long way to go, we really have made great progress.
Let me touch on real quick because that's one thing that I always get the question is why has the life expectancy changed so drastically? And a lot of people don't understand. So do you want to touch on the reasons why the life expectancy for individuals with Down syndrome has increased so much?
Well, my personal opinion is that it has a lot to do with the improvements in healthcare. And it has a lot to do with improved research in medical care for people with Down syndrome. The Global Down Syndrome Foundation and others have advocated for more research dollars, and those research dollars have uh, turned into evidence based practices to treat health problems, whether it's the heart or thyroid or leukemia or whatever. We'll have a long way to go on the Alzheimer's front, but we've made a lot of progress in other fronts.
For me, that's amazing. So, what is the biggest thing that you've learned over the 40 years of advocacy that you would like somebody that has become new to this journey to know?
I think the biggest thing is that real people can make a difference. And that's something that's hard for people to understand. That so often people will think, well, I don't know anybody important. Why would my school board member or my member of Congress or my state legislator listen to me? And what I've learned over the years and what I've tried to do in training with others is to help people understand that they really can make a difference. And if we don't, who will?
Right. You I live by the mantra of you never know who's watching, and that really is evident. You don't know how your story can impact somebody unless you tell it.
That's right.
Stephanie, how has being Laura's mother shaped your approach to policy and leadership throughout your career?
I have always been interested in public policy and politics since I was very young. In my dinner table at home growing up, my dad would ask questions like, "Do you know the difference between capitalism and socialism?" And there would be a discussion about it. So I've always been interested in these topics. I studied political science in college and worked on Capitol Hill for about 10 years after I graduated. But since Laura was born, my focus has been very much on disability policy, education, employment, community living, and Laura's been my inspiration and the driving force behind what I do every day. She was also, Laura passed away in 2016, so when I talk about her in the past tense, that's why. But she's always been my partner. When she was a baby, once she got out of the hospital, she'd be with me when I went and talked to state legislators or others. And then she'd be standing beside me when I read her words. And then she'd be speaking up herself. The best advocates are self advocates.
I can attest to that. Like I serve on a lot of boards here in Oklahoma, and we run into the same issue. And I mentioned to them, we're going to be fighting the same problem unless you put people on these boards or you hire people with lived experience that live it 24/7 because they're the people that live it. And even though you understand to some degree, you will never understand the 24/7 fight that individuals with disabilities have. So I
Right.
completely agree with your sentiment there that the best advocates are self advocates.
And I'd like to build on something that you said, Bryce. It's so important to develop and maintain relationships with people who are making the policies, whether they're school board or county commissioners, state legislators, members of Congress. And a good way to do that is to get on boards and to get on advisory committees and learn the topics and get to know the people who are making decisions and become known as someone who's good to have.
Cultivating relationships with your representatives and your senators, that's one of the things that Summer and I were challenged to do when we went through partners in policymaking. And Summer and I have done a wonderful job of cultivating relationships, and we plan on having as many state and national representatives on this podcast to start cultivating conversations with everyone in the policy world because we want conversations to be made, and that's the first step to do so.
Great plan.
Do you have any stories about Laura that you want to share with us today?
Well, I mentioned that, I would bring her with me, and then sometimes I would read her words before she was able to do that. Uh, in the early 1990s, I was working and organizing a group of families to try to stop the Fairfax County, Virginia School Board from making drastic cuts to special education. And this was before social media. It was before a lot of fancy stuff. We had our signs, that we made with magic markers, but we had a big crowd, and that makes a difference. And Laura and her friend Marty were sitting in the front row. I think she was about maybe 3rd grade then, and they were reading their books while they were waiting, and I could see those school board members looking at Laura and Marty, and you could see on their faces like, "Oh, they can read." And then Laura had asked me when I testified to read something that she had written for Martin Luther King Day, as we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. So I said, Laura asked me to read what she wrote for school. And what she wrote was, I have made a dream to be a PTA president like mom.
Wow.
Well, it was so interesting to see their faces and thinking, you could see they were thinking, oh, she learned about Martin Luther King. She can express her dreams. I'll tell one more story. I was asked to testify before the House Education and Workforce Committee about special education funding, and this was back when Laura was in high school. Well, she saw there was another mom there with her son who was testifying, so she said to me, "He's gonna talk. Can I talk?" And I thought, "Okay, well, I'll ask." So I asked the staffer, and he asked the chairman, "Well, yeah, well, he has a name tag. Can I have the name thing that goes in front?"
Right.
Okay, so
Sure.
she got that. So She wrote out what she was gonna say, and if you've ever watched, a committee hearing, you'll see that they're not paying attention, they're chattering, they're looking at their phones, they didn't have them then. But when Laura talked, she didn't have a lot to say, but when she talked, every member on that committee was listening to her, and quite a few of them came up to talk to her afterwards.
That's incredible. What was the most impactful moment that you feel like Laura made as an advocate while she was on this earth?
I think one of the most impactful things that Laura did was when she was a senior in high school, she asked me where she would go to college. She wanted to know if she'd go to the same college her brother did. Well, there were not opportunities. There were a few around the country, but nothing near us. And so we went to George Mason University, asked if they'd be willing to start a pilot project, and they did. And Laura and two friends were the first students. And then after that, Laura would present, sometimes with me, sometimes with other people at national conferences. And I think she really made an impact because it was one thing for me to talk about these things or talking about the law change, but it was something else for other students and for families to hear Laura. Articulation was difficult, and she had a PowerPoint, that she would use, but I could see students in the audience looking at Laura and thinking, "Oh, you mean me too?" Are the parents looking at Laura and thinking, "Well, you mean my child too?" Yes. So she really did make an impact on increasing post-secondary opportunities.
That's wonderful. And I think that she would be very proud to know that there's post-secondary opportunities all over the country now. So
She would. There's, over 360 now.
So, you've worked in the Senate, the House of Representatives, the Department of Education for national advocacy organizations. How did your personal journey prepare you for those leadership roles?
I worked on Capitol Hill. I hate to age myself, but I was a young staffer on Capitol Hill when the first version of IDA passed in 1975. I can't take credit for it. I did some work on it, but I didn't really understand special education until I had a daughter with disabilities. And the experiences that Laura had and that the other people had that I knew through Laura had a major impact on how I viewed education for students with disability and what needed to be done to improve it.
throughout your career, you worked across political parties and administrations. What lessons have you learned about building bipartisan relationships for support on disability issues?
I've worked for both Republicans and Democrats over the years, and we've had champions for disability issues from both parties, whether it's in education or the Americans with Disabilities Act or other types of things. It's been very important to have leaders from both parties. And it's important to build relationships with policymakers, whether they're in Congress or school board members or state legislators uh, from both parties. Now, sometimes they will vote the way you want, and sometimes they won't. But it's always important to thank them when they do and continue trying to build those relationships and help them understand what policies mean to real people.
You've trained thousands of grassroots advocates over the years. What separates advocates from creating lasting change from those who become discouraged?
The ones who create lasting change, keep at it. That is the most critical thing, to just keep at it and work to create those relationships with policymakers and staff before there's a crisis and keep in touch. It can sometimes take years to get a bill's passed. And once a bill is passed, there's regulations and guidance to keep on top of and influence. It took us 10 years to get the ABLE Act passed, but it was worth it to get it done.
Yes, it
And
is.
the advocates who are in it for the long term are the ones who make the most impact. And I have to say that I understand it can be very discouraging. There have been many times over the years when things have looked really bleak, but we've always managed to come back and get policies changed or improved. And I know there's some bad things happening right now. So it's really important to remember that, as I said, real people can make a difference and to never, ever, ever give up.
Stephanie, our personal stories are so important, but sometimes I think advocates struggle to connect their personal stories to policy change. How did you learn to translate lived experience into legislation and to public policy?
Well, that was something that kind of came naturally to me, but I know it doesn't come naturally to everybody. And, at the National Down Syndrome Congress, we believe that it's important to listen to the people that are really impacted, to listen to people with disabilities and their families and allies, and that's the first step. Find out what are their experiences, what's going well, what's not going well, and what are the priorities, and then to base policy recommendations on those experiences. At NDSC, we survey our National Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition, NDAC members, on a variety of topics to find out what is important to them. And then the next step is training people how to tell your story and tie it to the policy objective. Because it's not okay just to tell a story. I've been in a meeting with a member and we were talking about employment, and somebody started talking about how the bus wasn't coming on time. You got to tie the story to the policy point. So training people how to do that, to identify what is their personal experience, and then how to share that in a way that makes an impact is really important. And we're having our big convention in July in Orlando. We have about 3,500 people, and we'll have an advocacy training boot camp there. And that'll be the purpose to teach people how to tell their stories and have effective communication. And then we're also having a policy summit in September in Washington, D.C. And again, it'll be focused on how do you tell your story in a way that has an impact?
When people often hear about the IEDA, they often associate that with the IEP. What are some lesser known ways that the OSEP impacts the lives of children and families across the United States?
OSEP, or the Office of Special Education Programs, is in the U.S. Department of Education. And that's the office that's responsible for implementing the special education law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So some of those responsibilities include writing regulations when IDEA is reauthorized, sharing guidance on the law and how to implement it, and funding grants for national activities like parent training centers. A big responsibility is monitoring the states and ensuring that the states are enforcing the law. States have what's called a general supervision responsibility to make sure the local districts are following the law, and it's OSEP's responsibility to monitor those states. Every year they have to submit what's called an annual performance report, and the OSEP staff analyze that. And if there are areas that need improvement, then the state needs to come up with a plan for how they're going to improve it. And sometimes more enforcement is necessary.
Can we go into that maybe a little bit? I hear a lot of people say that the power needs to go back to the states and that the Department of Education is, too much oversight. Why is it important to have that accountability on a federal level and not everything on the state level?
Well, no, that's a question that we hear. And before the first version of IDEA was passed in 1975, the states pretty much ran things, and there were countless children with disabilities that the states did not allow to go to school. There were a million children in institutions, And Congress decided, rightfully so, that there's a constitutional responsibility for states to educate students with disabilities. And the the version we now have, IDEA, uh, is there to ensure accountability and also to be in partnership with the states to provide the guidance and technical assistance to help them understand how to do it well. This talk about turning education back to the states, it doesn't make sense because the local schools and states are already responsible for determining what students are going to learn. They're already responsible for deciding licensure requirements for teachers. They're responsible for curriculum. What the Office of Special Education Programs is responsible for doing is ensuring that the states are doing what they need uh, to have the local districts following the law to ensure that children with disabilities and youth with disabilities have a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. Now, I have to tell you that I know that it doesn't always go well. And unfortunately, it depends on where you live, what school district, what state you live in, how well services are being provided, and how
Yeah.
well the law is being forwarded. But you don't blow up the system because it needs improvements. And what's being put in place right now, as of this week, is moving the Office of Special Education Program. There has been movements by the Department of Education to dismantle the department. There have been these so-called interagency agreements, IAAs, that have been moving pieces of the Department of Education to other agencies. And I might be getting a little ahead here, but it came out this past week that the plan is to move OSEP to the Department of Health and Human Services, to move uh, the Rehabilitation Services Administration, that is responsible for vocational rehabilitation, support for employment, to move that to Health and Human Services. Neither one of those things makes sense. And to move the Office of Civil Rights to the Department of Justice. So none of these changes, none of these transfers of pieces of offices are doing one thing to move education back to the states. They are creating bureaucracy. They are going to make it harder for the states, harder for schools, and harder for parents.
So, as someone that actually led OSEP, what concerns you most when decisions arise about reducing its authority or weakening federal oversight?
Well, let me give you an example of federal oversight. Texas was limiting the percentage of students who could be evaluated and found to have a disability. So if you didn't fit into their percentage, I think it was 8%, then you didn't get special education services. It wouldn't matter if you're blind or deaf or have Down syndrome or something else. If you didn't fit into their percentage, you wouldn't get what you're legally entitled to by the federal law. The OSEP worked with this state of Texas and got that turned around. It wasn't easy. It took a couple of different times and whatever. But now, if you have a disability, if you're a student with a disability, you're supposed to get the services and not have to fit into this percentage. That's an example of the kind of oversight responsibility that is so critically important.
What would be the real world consequences for students, families, and schools if the federal government's commitment to IDEA enforcement would be diminished completely?
Well, first of all, I'd like to clearly state that the law would still be there. There still would be a requirement to evaluate whether or not a child has a disability, and if they're found to have a disability and a need of special education, to provide it. The law would still be there about IEPs and so on. What what will start or would start diminishing is the accountability that we now have, and it would be much harder for states and schools to get straight answers because they wanna divide up with general education and Department of Labor and, special education and HHS and, some other part, the OCR that handles discrimination and Department of Justice. So you would lose the kind of collaboration and coordination that we've all worked so hard to achieve over the last decades.
So, you played important roles in both the 1997 and the 2004 reauthorizations of IDEA. What were some of the most important advances that came from those efforts?
Well, the reauthorization of IDEA in 1997 was the result of a 3-year battle uh, and a unique consensus process that ultimately resulted in a very positive bill. Um, One of the most important improvements, in my view, is that all students are expected to participate in and make progress in the general curriculum. There was no provision prior to that time that students with disabilities learn the same things as other students. Also, for the first time, there was a requirement that all students with disabilities participate in state and district assessments and that there be alternate assessments as needed. And without those assessments, there is not accountability for the academic achievement of those students. There were also new provisions requiring stronger parent participation, requiring the general education teacher be part of the IEP team. There were stronger due process protections and addressing behavior proactively instead of through punishment. So there were some very important provisions in the IDEA 97 reauthorization. And we should note that in 2001, No Child Left Behind was passed. And this was the first time there was accountability for the academic achievement of students with disabilities. Then in 2004, the last reauthorization of IDEA, there was alignment of the No Child Left Behind requirements and IDEA. And something that's important for students, particularly students with intellectual cognitive disabilities, is that there is a new requirement that schools need to summarize academic and functional performance for every student with disabilities leaving high school. So they have something to take with them to college or a job that shows what they've learned. It also required transition services to start no later than age 16. So those are a few of the key changes.
You also worked on landmark initiatives like Able Act and Ticket to Work. Which of these accomplishments do you think had the greatest impact on the everyday lives of people with disabilities and their families?
Well, I spent quite a bit of time and effort on the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act, including getting an amendment through, serving on the Ticket to Work Advisory Committee. But I have to say that between that and the ABLE Act to me has broader, more long-lasting impact. This is, of course, the law that allows people with disabilities or to save or their family members to save for them in a way that does not impact their benefits. Because as I think you know, there's asset limitations to get SSI, supplemental security income, and with the ABLE Act, you can save without it impacting that. So I think that's really had lasting impact.
So, one of your signature achievements was helping amend the Higher Education Act to include students with intellectual disabilities. What barriers existed before those changes, and what opportunities have been created since?
Mentioned that Laura was first of 3 students at the inclusive program at George Mason University, and that was, I think, 2007. And shortly after that, I became the OSEP director. And I've been hearing from families around the country that their students wanted these kind of opportunities, and what was available was so limited. and there was no access to financial aid. There really were only a very few programs anywhere in the country, and they were mostly completely separate kind of programs. So I worked with a committee that we're still meeting. I'm still co-chairing the Inclusive Higher Education Committee, and we approached Congress to amend the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008 to allow students with intellectual disabilities to access financial aid, not loans, but student grants and work study programs. And one of the something that really helped us was that Eunice Shriver got interested. My friend Madeline Will, who I worked with on this, invited Mrs. Shriver to go visit the George Mason program and also some programs in New Jersey that Madeline had gotten started. And she said, "This is wonderful. I must tell Teddy." And that was a huge help because she told Teddy and she told Senator Orrin Hatch, who's a Republican, and she told the Secretary of Education. And we were able to get Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate to approve these new provisions that allowed financial aid and uh, created what's called comprehensive transition programs, CTPs, and defined uh, if the students enrolled in a CTP, they could get financial aid and also funded model programs called TIPSIDS and the National Coordinating Center, which has been at Think College now since 2010 when the funding first became available. So now students are able to fill out the FAFSA and get financial aid. We now, as I said, have over 360 programs around the country. Many of these have been funded through the model programs, and there's more that needs to be done, but it's been huge progress.
As the president of the Inclusive Higher Education Accreditation Council, where do you see inclusive post secondary education heading in the next decade?
One of the provisions in the language we're able to get in the Higher Ed Act, as I said, it authorized a national coordinating center, and it required the national coordinating center to convene a work group of experts to develop model program accreditation standards that could be used to accredit these programs. And I chaired a work group for 10 years, and uh, over a 15-year period, we came up with the program standards. We have started an accreditation council, which is accrediting programs. And what that is doing is it's um, providing kind of a good housekeeper seal of approval for programs that have been accredited, that they meet a basic standard that students and parents can know. And it's also driving uh, continuous program improvement. What I see over the next decade, what I hope to see is a continued expansion of opportunities all over the country, no matter where you live or no matter your family's financial situation, that if you choose to pursue higher education, there is that possibility.
I would love to say, as a college graduate myself, I would love to help you in any way as a self advocate to help continue the fight so we can get programs like this all around the country because this is something that truly needs to happen. So, any way that I can help as a self advocate, I would love to do so.
Well, thank you, Bryce. I appreciate that. We have been lucky that the president's budget request did continue funding for these model programs in the National Coordinating Center, and I really think that having so many people around the country speak up really helped with that.
That's good news.
Yes, that's
That's
very good news.
Yeah, we have to celebrate when there's good
yeah,
news.
Yes,
yes.
yes.
So, what are the biggest threats and the biggest opportunities for disability rights in America today?
Right now, the the 3 biggest areas that I see that are threats are, first of all, this dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education. I truly believe that this is gonna set us back decades, particularly for students with disabilities, if it goes through. and if it is not reversed. Another real threat is what's happening with Medicaid. This so-called One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed, HR 1, cut $1 trillion from Medicaid, and states are now grappling with, do we cut services? Do we raise taxes? Do we move money from other areas into Medicaid? And as you likely know, Medicaid is health insurance, but it also provides other services for people with disabilities and older people, including employment supports, transportation, support to live in your home. And unfortunately, what's called home and community-based services, those services that support people to live in their community and in their home, those are considered optional services. So states can cut those. And this is a real concern. A related concern is a memo that just came out this past week from the Department of Justice that I'm paraphrasing here, but it's basically saying that the Olmstead Supreme Court decision, which is critically important, and the Americans with Disabilities Act does not mean that you have to serve people in their community if they're able to live in their community. And unfortunately, is a setup to lead us to back to institutionalization. Now, it does not have the force of law, but it's not a good thing. There's also been a lawsuit that was filed by 17 states' attorney generals that would weaken the Section 504 protections that are very important, including the protections about living in the community. Now, we're getting to the good news now. Advocates in individual states have convinced their state governments to drop out of this lawsuit. There were 17 and now there's 6. So that shows that advocacy can work.
Yes.
And we do have other examples of advocacy really working. And another example of that is the administration proposed for last year's fiscal year, the fiscal year 2026 Education Department budget, to what's called block grant, part of IDEA. And what that would have done was eliminated the funding for the parent training and information centers and for the national centers that provide assistance to states and schools in how to educate students with disabilities. It also would have gotten rid of the preschool uh, funding, specific funding for preschool students. So we beat that back and on a bipartisan basis. That was not easy, but we did, and so far it's looking good for the fiscal year '27. So it's important to celebrate when we do have successes, and it's also important to think about the long term because, as I've said, times have been bleak in the past for various reasons, and as a disability community, we've managed to overcome the the policies and the problems that have occurred.
You
All
know,
right.
we just had Jawanda on here, Jawanda Mast on here
Yes,
a few weeks ago, and she said several times advocacy is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes.
that's right.
And so I want people to hear these stories because I do see a lot of comments that say people say, "Well, they don't listen to us." So, kind of like, why bother? But they do.
They do, they do. I mentioned the 3-year battle over the IDEA reauthorization. It was one of the hardest things I've ever participated in, and I volunteered about 50 hours a week for 3 years on it, and, um we were able to, partly through a wonderful man named David Hoppy, who was the Republican Majority Leader's chief of staff and has a son with Down syndrome. He managed to get the House and the Senate, the Republicans, the Democrats, to all stop the legislative process and had offered opportunities for anyone who wanted to come and discuss specific parts of the law. And families from all over the country came to Washington, D.C. David Hoppy stood up there for 10 hours at a time and he listened to people. And one of the things that happened that was wonderful is that as the parents are talking, the school representatives started thinking, oh, well, I can understand that. And sometimes the parents would think, well, I can understand why that would be a problem for them. And we ended up with really a wonderful reauthorization. But it was really hard, and it took everyday people participating and telling their stories.
My final question for you, Stephanie, if Laura was sitting with us today and reflecting on your journey together, what do you think she would have said has been the most important lesson that you have learned from each other and why?
Well, I think the most important lesson I learned from Laura was to listen to her and what she thought. And that wasn't always easy because articulation was very challenging
Quit
for
stuff.
her.
These
Um,
cats bullshit and told of you.
the if Laura hadn't told me that she wanted to go to college, I never would have spent 20 years working on inclusive post-secondary education. Um, I think the most what she learned from me is probably just what I've been saying, that you can make a difference and you have to speak up.
Yes, and you continue to do that. And it's amazing to see your dedication and your love for this community. And on behalf of a member of this community, we thank you for your continued great work.
Thank you, Bryce. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you today.
Yes, we appreciate you being on and all the work that you've done and all the advocacy that you've done for the disability community. There's really just no words to express our gratitude. So,
Well, we're about out of time for Where the Ram Bends. Till next time, I'm Bryce,
and I'm Summer.
and this is Where the Ram Bends and Where Your Journey Begins. Till next time, bye bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Those small actions make a big difference in helping others discover our podcast. We believe these conversations matter. By sharing stories, experiences, and perspectives from the disability community, we hope to increase awareness, understanding, and inclusion for people with disabilities and their families. Your support helps us continue this work and reach more listeners who need these conversations. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with a friend or on social media. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us for this episode. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Those small actions make a big difference in helping others discover our podcast. We believe these conversations matter. By sharing stories, experiences, and perspectives from the disability community, we hope to increase awareness, understanding, and inclusion for people with disabilities and their families. Your support helps us continue this work and reach more listeners who need these conversations. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with a friend or on social media. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.